So let's wrap this module up. And right before we finish, let's actually start wrapping it up by improving our code a little bit. We got all this code in this file, and actually, typically, you write multiple or work with multiple files. And why don't we create a new file that actually contains our routing logic? So the logic where we check the URL and do different things. So I'll create a new file here, routes.js. The name is up to you, and I get this special icon by my IDE. It is a normal JavaScript file, don't be confused. And in that file, I basically want to have my if statements here and my default response code. So I'll cut all of that out of here so that this is a pretty lean file and move it into routes.js. Now, this wouldn't work like that. Let me say that. We'll have to tweak that. But this is now the code moved over. I don't need the file system in app.js anymore, so we can remove that import. We do need HTTP because we still use that there. And we don't need the URL and method here, so let's remove that. Go over to routes.js, add this fs import at the top, and now start working with that. Now, what do we need to do in this file? We somehow need to be able to connect app.js to routes.js, right? Because we need to be able to send our incoming request to that file, so to say. And for that, let's create a new function. I'll name it request handler, and we can either create a function like this. It should receive request and response as arguments, just as this function does, because we'll effectively replace that function. Or we use a ES6 function, storing it in a constant request handler, which looks like this. Bit of a strange syntax if you've never seen it before, but we're essentially creating an anonymous arrow function which we store in a constant, and this therefore is the function name. Now here, we again receive request and response, and in that function, we now move all that code, because that code obviously uses the request and response objects. So we need to have them available as local variables, and we do now because these arguments are now named this way. We also use URL and method, so we need to re-add these constants by getting that data from the request URL, and request method. And now we just need to export this handler. We're importing with this required syntax, but how are we exporting in Node.js? There are two ways of exporting. The first one is to go at the bottom and add module.exports. This is another keyword or object which is exposed globally to you by Node.js, which has an exports property, and we can assign a value to this, like our request handler. So this constant which holds this function, it's now stored in module exports. And since this is a global object exposed by Node, Node is actually able to work with this, and we can now import from that routes.js file by requiring it, and Node will look for module exports and see if something was registered for this file here. And we do register something in module exports, the request handler. And you can register anything here. You can add a new JavaScript object with multiple key value pairs, whatever you need. Here, I'll just register my function. So now I can go back to app.js and import my routes. The name of that constant is up to you, by requiring it. And since this is now not a global module, we don't just type routes. Instead, we want to add a local path to it with /. And you can omit .js because Node.js will automatically attach this at the end. You can add it though, but I'll just type /routes, separate it from the core modules to make it really clear that this is a custom file. And now Node will go ahead and look for a routes.js file in the same folder as app.js, which it will find. And in that file, it will look for module exports and see what's registered in there. And now we export that request handler method. And now we can use that. It will be stored in that routes because we assign whatever is exported from that file in that routes constant. So this routes constant will ultimately hold this function. And now we can use that here as a handler, routes. Don't execute it, so no parentheses. Just pass the name telling Node, hey, please execute the function that's stored in routes for incoming requests. And now if we save that and we restart the server and we reload this page, this is looking good. And this is also looking good. We should have tests stored in message.txt, and we do. So now we simply split our code over 2 files, having one file, which is very lean, that just spins up the server, but, and that's important, that also creates a connection to another file through that import and through that export, where we export our request handler function here. This is how that works. Now, one important note about Node's module system: the file content here is actually cached by Node, and we can't edit it externally. So if we somehow would define routes as an object and we try to add a new property on the fly here, this would not manipulate the original file. So this is basically locked, not accessible from outside. We can only export stuff that we can now read from outside. Though you could have functions which you export that start changing stuff inside of that file, but let's not make that too complicated for now. We'll see all of that throughout the course, obviously. For now, we have that connection. There's one other syntax you could use instead of module exports. Sometimes you export many things, and you could do that by having an object which has like the handler key, and that is my request handler function. And then also it has the some text key, which is some hard-coded text in this case. Now we would export 2 things, and that is how you can group that or separate these 2 things and still have one export being managed here, which is the most you can have. And now in app.js, routes would be that object and not that function. So here we would have to access the handler property. So this property, which holds the function reference we want to use. And we could also simply output console.log routes some text here. So this is how we can have multiple exports in one file. Now you see some hard-coded text here from this console log, and we still have the same functionality as before. Now, there also is a different way of exporting multiple things. Besides this code, which you can, of course, use, you can also have module.exports.handler, request handler, and then also module.exports.some text, some hard-coded text. Now it might look different, but we still only have one export. We still only have module exports, which bundles all the exports, but we explicitly assign the different properties like this. So this is basically the equivalent to this code. If I now save this and restart my server, oops, we see some hard-coded text. And if I submit this, it also still works. And last but not least, there is a shortcut for this syntax. You can now omit module and just write exports. This is simply a shortcut supported by Node.js, not some general JavaScript magic. It's just an explicit shortcut supported by Node.js, where now we also have multiple exports being merged together into one export. So therefore, again, when I execute this, we see some hard-coded text and some last value being submitted here. Still works and still ends up in message.txt. So this is how we can connect multiple files by exporting either one element, one function as we had it initially with module.exports equals request handler, right? This is what we had initially. Let me comment this out with 2 slashes in front of it. Or module exports pointing at an object to combine multiple things, or using module.exports.handler equals request handler and module.exports.some text equal some text. Or again, this shortcut, which is the same as this, just with this shortcut offered by Node.js. So this is how imports and exports work, how the module system works, and we'll work with a lot of files throughout the course. So this is important to understand. With that out of the way, let's now finally wrap this module up.